Good morning, everyone. Give people a couple of seconds as we have people entering from the waiting room. Wonderful. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you all so much for making time in your schedules to participate in the 2025 Lab to Land workshop. Our topic for the next 2 days is advancing water and soil research for agricultural resilience. So this workshop series is being delivered in partnership between the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food and BC Agricultural and the BC Agricultural Climate Research Network. I want to start off by saying a huge thank you to the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Clean BC for their support on this workshop. Their financial support has allowed us to offer this workshop at no cost to participants and allows us to make the session recordings available to the public. I want to start off sharing a little bit about BC ACARN. So BC ACARN is a multi-institutional research network that was launched in 2017 out of UBC's Centre for Sustainable Food Systems. ACARN brings together agricultural climate researchers, government, and industry to build strong collaborative research partnerships and drive development of innovative climate solutions. Our mission is to connect producers with reliable climate research and practical solutions. So ACARN is a small but mighty team. I'm Dr. Lavesi Chili, the ACARN manager. Also facilitating this workshop today is Asha Reram, our project coordinator, and our team is also supported by Juliana and Subin. Our mission is really to advance and catalyze a resilient and thriving food system in BC. And to do that, BC ACARN provides a series of programs. Our team works with agricultural researchers and graduate students to support them in translating research into producer-facing fact sheets, infographics, and research briefs. We also leverage our network of over 2,000 individuals to facilitate and host events for sector stakeholders to identify research priorities and collaborate on climate solutions. And finally, we also work within the sectors to support knowledge sharing around key priority topics and also to showcase new research, tools, and practices. And this is what's bringing us here together today for the Lab to Land series. So this workshop series started in 2019 as a space for researchers to collaborate and set priorities. And now it's grown into this provincial online workshop to include a very diverse audience that we have in the room today. So I just want to take a moment before we dive into our content today to start by centering ourselves on our topic. So it is a wonderful, beautiful morning here in BC, and I'm hoping it's a beautiful morning wherever you're joining us from. So if you want to take a moment to look out the window or just close your eyes and really start to imagine, first think of water, the flow of it as it cascades down a riverbed, or the slow rush of the ocean tide sweeping in and out of the shore. Think about how water and how it moves with the wind as it dances over the surface, the water that gets swept up as the ground heats, the water which is captured in clouds and then falls as snow onto our mountains or rain onto our soils. The rain and water is what nourishes us. It's the lifeblood of our ecosystems. And as we connect our hearts and minds to the water that flows beneath our feet and rushes above our heads, let us recognize that this lifeblood is what joins us with each other and with the Indigenous peoples who have lived and cared for these lands for generations and who continue to carry this knowledge forward. I respectfully and humbly acknowledge that the BC Agricultural Climate Research Network operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of BC's Indigenous peoples. I'm a newcomer to Canada, and since I've landed on these shores, I've been inspired by the teachings of our First Nations communities. And I've seen those values reflected in the values of the Indigenous Māori people of New Zealand, where I grew up, and my Tiv ancestors in Nigeria, where my family is from. And these teachings are really around the fact that water is what sustains us. It's a sacred resource to the First Nation communities here in BC, and those communities recognize our collective responsibility to protect and conserve water for generations to come. The themes of stewardship and collaboration run through the work of ACAN and through this workshop series that we'll be hosting over the next 2 days. We'll hear from speakers and projects dedicated to bringing Indigenous ways of knowing to the forefront. So let's just take a moment to pause, breathe, and reflect on what we all hope to get out of today. And feel free to note it down for yourselves. Okay, so let's dive into our session for today. So over the next 2 days, we have 2 mornings together where we're going to be digging into many aspects of research extension and the challenges and solutions for addressing some of climate change's challenges within the agricultural sector. Starting today, our focus will be on water, and we'll discuss collaborative approaches to drought resilience. Our presentations will span Indigenous water co-governance, drought strategies, and evapotranspiration networks. Tomorrow, we're going to be focusing on soil and supporting ecosystem and community resilience. We hope you can join us for day 2. So this morning, we're going to start with our preliminary presentation, which is an Indigenous partnered research project. Later in the morning, we're going to have a showcase of projects which are taking different approaches to actioning BC's drought strategy. And finally, we'll wrap up our session today with a facilitated discussion on evapotranspiration and a networking opportunity across different water research areas. We really hope you can stay with us for the whole morning, but as I mentioned, these sessions will be recorded and available for review at a later date. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into our first plenary presentation. The session will be recorded and it will be available on the BC ACAN website and our YouTube channel after this workshop. Not today, but next week. Please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts on the different presentations. And we do have a Q&A box, so feel free to add any questions you'd like to the Q&A. And all the attendees can also upvote questions that they're interested in hearing. At the end of each session today, there will also be a lot of time for Q&A. We do have captions enabled. You can look at the bottom of your screen and see captions, show captions or hide captions. You can feel free to hide those captions if they're not going to be helpful for you today. Okay, so we're going to get started with our first session, which is going to be a presentation by Natasha Overduim. Natasha is a facilitator with Compass Resource Management, specializing in planning and decision-making for natural resource management. She currently serves as the Executive Director for the Koksilah Water Sustainability Plan and collaborates with the Cowichan Tribes and the Government of BC to lead this groundbreaking initiative, the first of its type in the province. Natasha is driven by a passion for helping groups achieve better outcomes for the land and water and their interconnected relationships. So welcome, Natasha. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We are so excited to have you to present in this workshop. So I will hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the warm welcome and for the invitation to be here with you today. It's really exciting to join you and to be able to share a little bit about this really exciting initiative. As Dr. Chile mentioned, I'm a facilitator, and my entire career has focused on water and water decision-making and water management. And I know that everyone in the audience today is facing different water challenges in their communities. And what my career has really led me to believe is that water can be a very powerful facilitator for solutions. And I'm excited to talk about the solutions in the Koksilah in particular. As mentioned, I'm working for Cowichan Tribes and province of BC in this executive director role. And there's many people involved from both governments doing really incredible work. So I'm grateful to be here kind of as a spokesperson for that bigger team. I wanted to mention that Ministry of Agriculture is a signatory to the agreement between Cowichan Tribes and the province to do this planning process. And there are, I believe, some folks from the Ministry of Agriculture in the audience. So when we get into the Q&A, perhaps they will have some comments and be able to answer questions as well. I wanted to start by saying that I really, despite the problems that we're facing in the province of BC and in Canada and globally around water, I do feel extremely hopeful about the future. And I'm going to spend the bulk of the presentation talking about solutions. But I am going to start with talking about the problem we're trying to solve, both in a big picture sense and in the Koksilah specifically, because we are trying to untangle some very big knots. And I think it does help to set the stage with understanding kind of the various aspects of the problem that we're trying to solve. So that's what I'll cover. I'll talk about the problem, how we're solving that problem, touching on Koksilah, but also the big picture. I'll conclude with some lessons learned, and throughout, I'm going to highlight some of the benefits of Indigenous involvement and leadership in water management and decision making, leaving space for questions and discussion. So, the problem. What is the problem we are trying to solve? As I said, there are many problems, and there are many angles to come at the problem from. At the kind of biggest picture level, I think the pictures here describe the problem better than words. They show both pictures from the Cowichan region where the Koksilah Watershed is located. Both pictures show these extreme swings from too much to not enough water, and they illustrate our general unpreparedness for change and the driver for why we need to be doing things differently. And it's a bigger problem than even just drought response and drought resilience. It's really a problem of unprecedented ecological and social change, with drought being this very acute kind of symptom where that plays out. The root causes of these big picture problems that are really in our face stem from the legal and institutional architecture that was created when the world was quite a different place from today. Anyone who is interested in change or who is frustrated by the status quo, I suspect, shares this kind of fantasy of being able to just erase and rewrite kind of our societal and legal rules from scratch. But that's obviously not the reality. We have the systems that we have around us, and we are working within those and having to evolve those systems, which is very challenging. But we can learn from the past in how we're moving forward. And there is, again, that hope and I think evidence of how these systems are changing, are adapting, are improving. And I'm going to be talking about that. But just dwelling for a minute more here on kind of that root complexity for water, specifically, a piece of the legacy architecture was the Water Act, created in 1906, and these are some images from that time. The Water Act created a system of rights that we continue to see today. It's based on principles of first in time, first in right. It's modeled on legal principles of private property. And those principles have limitations for resources like water that are so inherently shared with whatever's happening upstream, affecting the people and the environment downstream. So there's this sort of fundamental again, very big picture, a sort of existential root challenge in managing water that our legal systems kind of perpetuate. A specific point is that the Historic Water Act did not treat ground and surface water as one interconnected resource. So water below the surface, access through wells, was not regulated and was not managed. So you remember probably that an issue that really grabbed public attention and helped prompt and spark discussion and change ultimately was the controversy around bottled water and Nestle, and that water was being withdrawn for profits and so on. And so it's just a good example of how social pressure and learning can spark change. But generally, in 1906, lawmakers didn't anticipate, oops, I went one too far. Lawmakers didn't anticipate water scarcity. They didn't anticipate climate change. The law didn't really contemplate what a right means when the resource that someone has been granted a right to doesn't exist anymore, isn't available anymore, that the law doesn't give us an answer for how to deal with that kind of a situation. The law didn't anticipate that food security would be a pressing, defining challenge. And importantly, the Historic Act did not recognize Indigenous governance, Indigenous rights, didn't recognize that Indigenous people have their own laws, their own governance, and that those Indigenous systems and principles could actually offer some very powerful solutions and ideas. Fortunately, there were steps to modernize the Water Act, and a modernized water law was passed in 2016, and that's the Water Sustainability Act. Many of the kind of core legal foundations and principles did remain in place. So it was not like a wholesale overhaul, but the Water Sustainability Act created new tools for managing water and created opportunities to be able to do things differently and to do things better. One big change that I'm sure many of you are familiar with and that has affected your day-to-day business and life is that groundwater was brought into the system, so that water can be managed as one resource. And I'm sure there's many experiences here in this audience of how kind of complex and challenging and nuanced that has been in practice to bring groundwater users into the system. Another key change with the Water Sustainability Act was the creation of these new legal and policy tools, which are enabling. So they need to be triggered. They're available, but they need to actually be deliberately employed. And those are things that allow communities to create plans, to create objectives, to create new governance structures, new management structures for sharing water, for dealing with drought, and to address and untangle some of these historic issues and go forward with kind of a new and more regionally, locally tailored approach. In terms of highlighting the benefits of Indigenous leadership, Indigenous involvement, I think this is a really important place to just point at how Indigenous peoples across BC have been very strong advocates, very strong voices to use these tools and to do things differently. So they have been strong advocates for change and for the province and for communities to manage water in a way that is sustainable. And so that, having that as a driver has been really important. It's hard to imagine where we would be without that advocacy. So I'll now pivot to talk about the Koksilah, which is where we're doing this work to use these new tools. And I hope to demonstrate here, again, how water can really help bring people together. The Xwulqw'selu, or the Koksilah Watershed, is located on eastern Vancouver Island. It's a very small place, which this map really kind of emphasizes. But in this very small area, we see a lot of complex issues, the same issues that are being faced elsewhere, really coming to a head, very acute, acutely felt, like really very few kind of low-hanging fruit left. Like there's already, people are already doing what they can. It's at the margins. So it's a small but quite mighty place that others will, I think, learn a lot from over the next couple of years as our work comes into play. The Koksilah Watershed is part of Cowichan Tribes territory, and Cowichan people's historic memory says that Cowichan people have been in this place in the valley since time immemorial, as long as can be remembered. The Koksilah has a place in the Cowichan Tribes creation story, so it's a very spiritually significant place. And there's archaeological evidence dating Cowichan presence back thousands of years. So the importance really continues today, and it's been home for Cowichan people for a very, very long time. Today, about 5,000 people live in the watershed. It's a rural area. There's no kind of major suburban or urban development. And the primary water use is for agriculture, which is concentrated in the lower watershed. And these yellow and orange dots represent points of withdrawal or diversion. Something really important about the context in the Koksilah is that unlike other watersheds, there is no large lake or water supply. So the system has been described historically as kind of being flashy. It experiences big kind of peak flows, big winter events, floods, and then very, very drastic low flows in the summer and early fall. And these low flow times are threatening the survival of ecosystems and salmon. In terms of kind of human activities, land use is the things that can be managed. The watershed supports a range of agriculture, forage growers, dairy, vineyards, some fruit and vegetable, and dairy and forage being kind of the most significant agricultural presence. And important for dairy is the dairy sector on Vancouver Island has been drastically kind of declining, getting smaller over the past kind of couple decades. So the presence of dairy here is considered to be very important. And there are a number of families that have been farming in this valley for generations. In the upper watershed, forestry activity occupies about 80% of the watershed total, and it's mostly in the upper part of the watershed. And the forest cover has significantly changed over the past 100 years through logging and roads. There's very, very little old growth left in the watershed. And this really affects the hydrological cycle. So how water is stored, how it runs off, how it recharges the system, how it moves through the system. Those changes are very complex, and there is not a lot of detailed scientific research and understanding or consensus around exactly what those impacts are for low flows and what the best management strategies would be going forward. But it's pretty clear, like when you remove the old growth forest cover, it's going to have a very drastic effect on the water system. A complexity for planning for change in this watershed, and this is another one of those root causes, is that most of the forestry, most of the forested lands, over 70% of it, is private managed forest land. So in the early 19th century, to advance the ENN Railway, the Esquimalt and Nanaimo land grants by the Crown transformed over 800,000 hectares of Indigenous territory into private land. And those private lands are now part of British Columbia's private managed forest land regime, and they are subject to the Private Managed Forest Land Act. And many of the small forest owners, and as well as the larger owners, including Mosaic, are voluntarily committing to scrutiny of their operations through third-party certification programs and so on. However, governments have a more limited regulatory oversight role on private land, including local government has a limited role. And for Koksilah communities, both Cowichan Tribes and other residents who are downstream of these forestry activities and who are seeing major changes in their water supply, these challenges are really a big point of concern. And it's a really kind of unique complexity for this planning process, that it's private land. I think most other planning processes, they're crown lands, and it has a real difference for the process. The other complexity for planning, for making change in this watershed, is that water rights are over-allocated. So as I mentioned, until 2016, the law licensed only surface water and not groundwater. So in the Koksilah, surface water availability in the main stem and in the tributaries was actually noted as being fully recorded in 1980, which meant no more water to allocate in additional licenses. But because of the absence of groundwater regulation, well drilling and use continued, and the result, and individuals doing those activities were doing nothing wrong in doing that. But the result is that we are now in a situation where the rights and the demands for water surpass what the watershed can sustain. So the Koksilah is one of the few places in the province where the government of British Columbia is taking regulatory measures to protect flows and ecosystems during extreme periods. So they have issued temporary fish protection orders in, I believe, 2019, 2021, and 2023. And these regulatory curtailments are sustaining critical minimum water flows for fish survival. And there's some data and reports that you can find online that kind of review all the results of that. But they are kind of reactive measures, and they create socioeconomic uncertainty and cost, especially for farms requiring irrigation. So those TPOs, those temporary orders, have been a driver for doing something differently, have been a driver for doing a water sustainability plan, because there is widespread interest in finding a different solution, something that's more proactive, informed, and achieves better results for both ecosystems and water users. One thing to mention here is just how much, I mentioned earlier that kind of there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit. So I'll say here that local farmers and irrigators are already doing a lot, contributing a lot. So for example, there is a voluntary effort to coordinate the timing of irrigation to lessen impacts to stream flows. Many farms are adopting or exploring water storage and conservation practices, new technologies. Farms in the area have participated in restoration initiatives. And there was also a big move in this watershed a number of years ago to develop and implement environmental farm plans to address water quality. So there is a lot that the community has already been doing, and that's, I think, a reality in this process, a painful reality that even more is needed, because these root causes, these root drivers need to really be unpacked and explored. So solving the problem, I want to segue to that now and talk about what's being done around this. Recognizing that that there are these environmental impacts, there are these social impacts, Cowichan Tribes was really the voice and the driver to say something must be done here. The river, communities, Cowichan Tribes members who care about this system like a relative, they're seeing the system is struggling and that something needs to be done. So back in, I want to say 2019, Cowichan Tribes recruited legal thinkers, experts, community organizations, partners, conducted surveys with the broad community, conducted studies to try to organize efforts and do the legwork to make the case for doing a water sustainability plan in the Koksilah. The Water Sustainability Plan is one of those new legal measures under the Water Sustainability Act. We haven't done one of these in the province before. This is the first one. And it enables changes to be made in how water is managed. So it can create more specific tailored management rules. It can create new systems for monitoring, for reporting, for community involvement. The legislation doesn't tell us what the WSP needs to be. It's kind of like reading legislation is kind of like reading the rule book for a really complicated board game. So the legislation doesn't say, here's exactly what the solution is. It just kind of enables that process to take place. So what I thought I would do is tell you just kind of a couple of the key things about the process, and then share what we anticipate in terms of kind of results and outcomes. And then I'll close with some lessons learned for others. So the first thing about the process is that it's government to government. So it is guided by an agreement between Cowichan Tribes and the province. You can find the agreement on the Koksilah Water website. That agreement sets out the priorities that the governments have agreed to, which includes food security, community well-being, restoring ecosystems, protecting fish, bringing water back to the stream. And the decisions that are made to establish the plan to guide the process are all government-to-government decisions. And a real benefit, I think, of this kind of co-leadership, co-governance that others can learn from is that it really ultimately enhances transparency in decisions. It means that solutions and decisions are looked at through a broader lens, and that there's more attention to what the process needs to be to get to those decisions. One of the key influences of Cowichan Tribes has been to take a whole of watershed approach to this planning process. Cowichan Tribes has really strongly advocated for making sure that we kind of bust the silos, that it's not looking just at water or just at land use, but that the plan addresses the fact that water and land, what happens on the water, what happens on the land really affects the water, and that we need to look at things together as one whole picture. So that means that the WSP will be a package of land and water actions. It means that we're looking at water storage as a big part of the solution, not just changes in water use. It means we're looking at restoration and land use changes, and looking at the watershed in its entirety. So a huge benefit here, I think, of Indigenous involvement is that it leads to this really comprehensive way of looking at the problem and at the solution. Another highlight about the process that I think will be of interest to folks here is that it is community-based. So Cowichan Tribes in the province intentionally, in designing the process, setting the process up, created advisory tables, community advisory tables. You can see some photos of some of those folks here. There's a collaborative community advisory table is what it's called, which has 19 members, including farmers, including folks from the forestry sector, including community organizations and ENGOs. And that group is convening regularly. They've already met 3 times to give input and advice to the government-to-government decision makers. There's also a Cowichan Tribes guidance table, which is comprised of elders and knowledge holders and experts, which similarly convening to give expert advice and input to the decision makers. And we're bringing these tables together as well. So the picture on the bottom left shows a gathering where we actually brought everyone together to be learning and building relationships across communities. To me, these tables, this part of the process is part of what makes it really special. It's really, there's been a real effort to be inclusive, to talk to people, to bring them things in their sort of messy, we're still figuring it out stage, and really get input into the direction. And I've seen a lot of learning already happen. And I think some of that learning is crucial to ultimately being able to make changes. For example, I mean, one of the first things that we did was a watershed tour where, 20, 30 people were on a bus, and we actually visited a local farm, a dairy farm, to see the work being done by farmers and the impacts. So really just that learning has been really important, and I think is kind of at the heart of the process. This slide shows Cowichan Tribes teachings, legal principles, which are included in the agreement between Cowichan Tribes and the province. And the reason I share this here is because these principles, I think you can see how they speak to these ideas of working together to be stronger, taking care of things, respecting things, working to bring things into balance. So these are the kind of ideas that are guiding the work. And these are not short-term ideas. These are really long-term. And I see the work that we're doing in the plan that we're creating as just a milestone in this kind of broader shift to management that's more aligned with these kinds of ways of thinking and seeing the world. So those are a couple points about the process, and I just have 2 more slides, and I wanted to touch on how we're thinking about the end product and what that's shaping up to look like, the kind of concept that's in development, and then I'll conclude with some lessons learned. So this slide shows kind of a concept of how we're thinking about bringing water back to the stream. So we are exploring flow targets as a framework for improving stream flow in a way that everyone contributes to. So we're continuing to learn that to make meaningful change, meaningful improvements to bring water back to the river, it's going to require multiple kind of contributions. So this is visualizing that. The y-axis indicates summer low flows. So you can imagine that this is the flow that we often see when we would go to the river in the hot months of July and August. And the blue bars show what that stream flow may look like if no action is taken. If no action is taken, given climate change trends we're seeing, that blue bar would continue to decline as we see lower and lower stream flows. The hopeful part is that we have the ability to work together to improve summer stream flow through kind of a variety of measures, including land use changes and restoration, water storage, and water use reductions and management of water use. So this is what those colored bars represent. So the red bar, for example, illustrates that by reducing water use, we can increase that summer low flow. And reducing water use is the most kind of immediate, direct, short-term action that can be taken with the least time lag for the most kind of impact for the stream. The purple bar illustrates the addition of storage may have the ability to further increase that summer flow and over time reduce the water use reductions needed. And the green bar shows that through land use changes and restoration, there would be the ability to further improve summer stream flows. The key thing here in this picture that I want you to take away is that these colored bars are not drawn to scale, relative to one another or to actual numbers. There's no actual math here. This is just the kind of conceptual approach for thinking about multiple levers, multiple changes to improve stream flow. And actions could be sequenced over time to meet kind of short, medium, and long-term targets. So setting the target is a decision for the G2G tables, but then that decision about how to meet those targets, what the relative contributions are, is the really key decision. And that's where that input from those advisory tables is going to be so critical. So in conclusion, some lessons learned. I had kind of 5 points I wanted to touch on. The first is just the value of bringing people together to have the hard conversations. That there are very real impacts and there are very scary changes happening, and bringing people together to actually dig into practical ideas is what's bringing energy to this difficult work. I think I've highlighted throughout how Indigenous involvement and participation in that dialogue and in that decision-making leads to a more open and kind of inclusive, creative approach. So in simple terms, I feel like there's a lesson there that we should be taking this approach elsewhere, while recognizing that more inclusivity, more involvement, it doesn't make it, more straightforward. It makes it better, but it means having to embrace some messiness. When you have a room of 19 people, it's going to bring ideas that you might not have anticipated and might need, you might need to step back and consider how to achieve that interest. Another lesson learned is that Cowichan Tribes in the province set up quite a novel structure for this planning process. And this is something that I'd be happy to talk more about. And I'm not sure how interested folks are in kind of the nuts and bolts of organizational processes, but there's a lot of learning, I think, around how they set up a team and how they set up the work plans and structures, communications for this to work smoothly. And others could really, I think, benefit from learning about what worked and what didn't work in that. There's a really important lesson about how much to bite off. So I've described the benefits and the importance of taking this comprehensive, holistic approach. There are also challenges in that you can't do everything, you can't do it all at once. And so you need to set priorities and sequence those priorities over time, and not everyone will have the same priorities. And so the advisory tables have wrestled with that. The government-to-government table has wrestled with that. And that's something, if other places take this sort of broad whole of watershed approach, we should be ready for thinking about what are we going to focus on? What can we do in the short versus medium versus long term? Fourth, a lesson that I think others could benefit from is that in this process, we've tried to take a really decision-focused approach. So be really clear about the decisions that need to be made. So there are decisions about how to, about what flow targets to shoot for. There's decisions about what the contributions and changes should be for different sectors to achieve those targets. There's decisions about what kind of water storage options to implement, to put on the implementation pathway. So being really clear about the decisions that are being made through the plan so that the technical teams can then gather decision relevant information, I think is really important. Over my work with different groups in different places, I definitely see that it's very easy to do a lot of monitoring, information gathering, assessment that doesn't help make a decision. It's not decision relevant. So trying to really design these processes so that you're gathering decision relevant information, I think is a key takeaway. And finally, last kind of point on a big picture note, I think if we assume that we do in fact need these kind of community-based solutions, I think we need people and organizations who can convene and bring people together. So I'm a big fan of watershed organizations like the Cowichan Watershed Board or the Okanagan Basin Water Board, especially if there's opportunities for those organizations to have Indigenous leadership and Indigenous involvement. I would be really interested in seeing if, as a province, we could create the next iterations and expand and enhance these kind of regional bodies so that we have tables, people who have the capacity and the mandate to be doing this work, bringing people together, facilitating planning, facilitating decision making. So that's an idea I think could be really inspiring for the bigger trajectory for the province. Yeah, I think that kind of brings me to a close. I'll just maybe end by saying that again, I've really seen how water can be this incredible force for bringing people together. We're all tied to it, as you mentioned, Dr. Chile, in your opening comments. And there's a lot of really kind of cool opportunity to do things differently and to learn from each other and to start making changes. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions and to dig more into the details. This was a very kind of high level story, but there's a lot of specifics that I'm happy to get into, or if I can't answer them on the spot, to direct you to the people or resources that can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natasha, for that presentation. So interesting to hear about the work that you've been doing. And we have a lot of questions for you, which is wonderful. So let me just pull up the Q&A here. So we have a question. One person is curious about the process of creating the plan, the watershed planning agreement. It's been in the works since 2019. So what were if you could share some of the more difficult parts or the aspects which may have caused unexpected delays? This question asks, the question is really around how did you prioritize or sequence the different activities, especially when you're engaging with the community so directly as well?
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking about what to say here so that I don't talk for way too long trying to answer this question. Process has really, so I think a couple things about the process, and in terms of, to maybe focus on this idea of kind of sequencing. We have this mandate for a whole of watershed approach, as I mentioned, and to really look at the issues as interconnected. And that is a strength, but we had to make some choices about how far to go in different areas. And one of the ways we designed the structure, Cowichan Tribes in the province designed the structure, was to really think about having different teams and leads of teams led by different people to kind of go forth in kind of diving down the different rabbit holes and getting into the details of the different areas of solutions. So having a team focused on agricultural practices, having a team focused on land use changes and restoration, having a team focused on storage. And that is what we're doing. That's where we're at, and that's what the process is doing. But there was a challenge in getting that off the ground, I think. We didn't have, there weren't people in place, there weren't teams. All of that had to be created, partnerships had to be created, and figuring out how to create kind of like this whole organizational network to actually implement all those different areas of work was more ambitious than I think we realized. So we weren't able to do as much off the bat as expected. And we had to kind of prioritize some of the really urgent issues. So bringing water back into the stream and looking at water use and addressing those issues around the TPOs, which are negatively impacting users, rose to the top as kind of an urgent area of work. And we made more progress there than in some of the other areas off the bat. And it's taken us some time to kind of get the readiness to start actioning the solution work on the other pieces. It is happening, but it did take longer, I think, than I expected.
Yeah, I definitely understand that with these massive collaborative projects, the plan is one thing, but the execution is another. So really just being able to make sure that everyone's aware that things may take longer, but the overarching goal is to make sure that all of those voices are being heard. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Natasha. Another question that we have here, I think this is regards to the graph that you showed, which was very impactful, just to kind of see the different opportunities there with regards to solutions to try to increase that summer minimum water flow. So one of the questions in the chat is really just around, could you share some of the water storage options that are being considered?
Yeah, so one of the things that Cowichan Tribes in the province did, even before the planning process officially was launched with the ministerial order, in the pre kind of scoping phase, um, they retained a consultant to do sort of a high level scan of all the different storage opportunities. So we have this kind of phase one assessment of what the storage options are. And there's about a dozen, ranging from kind of on-site options like dugouts, tanks, gray water reuse, like things that farms and households can do, to kind of big community scale things like a new putting a weir in at one of the very small lakes to create, you know, more of a water bank with a lake, or aquifer recharge technologies. So we got this kind of big long list of storage options, and the next step is to determine, you know, which of these to put on the implementation pathway. These are, you know, these could all be in the scale of millions of dollars, and regulatory, you know, a lot of regulatory complexity to move them forward. So there's decisions around, you know, which of these and how to implement them. And then there's also questions around the sort of more site-specific options, which farmers, a number of farmers have expressed a lot of interest in. So there's kind of a multi-pronged approach on trying to understand which of these will make most sense in the Koksilah, and they all have pros and cons. So that's definitely a really important aspect of the work. And it was helpful and exciting that there were big investments towards agricultural water storage projects. So we are looking at whether we can get support from any of those funds for some of that work as well.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a little bit in your introduction that there's a gap in the science on the impacts on some of these changes to the way that the water is cycling. I'm wondering, you also mentioned that gathering decision relevant information is really important. I'm just wondering if you can speak to kind of the role of research within that relationship when we're thinking about wanting to figure out what is the best option across the watershed, and also based on specific local like contexts as well.
There's a really important role for research. And again, there's these kind of short, medium, long-term research questions. So in this sort of, especially in that sort of short to medium time frame, when I say decision relevant, I think it's really important to understand what is the choice that needs to be made here. Like, so for example, around storage options, and then design your monitoring, your assessment, your research to answer those questions, to help inform those decisions. But on a longer term horizon, there are actually just scientific kind of research questions and programs that might take 10 years of study. And so there's kind of multiple, I think, opportunities there for research. And I do think that longer term research arc is one that I think I want to make sure we don't lose sight of it, because there are some kind of bigger questions that will take more time to understand. And some of those questions are what is the optimal forest cover for, you know, a watershed that's experiencing low flows like that. There is a long-term kind of research question there.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that's been helpful and interesting is that, again, kind of as part of scoping and kicking off this process, Cowichan Tribes in the province developed a partnership with a research group at UVic that specializes in groundwater and hydrology and community-based monitoring. So they're involved in the process and have helped push the thinking in some cases, and kind of brought new ideas to the table. So it's been very, I think, beneficial, and again, one of those things that others could consider is where is there a role for an academic partner or research partner?
Mhm. Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. I really liked what you said, designing research to inform the decisions that we're making in the here and now, as well as those decisions that we anticipate we'll need to make in the future. So balancing kind of this quick and dirty research versus the really long scale work, which is, yeah, there's a space for all researchers within that.
And maybe I
Wonderful.
could add one thing to
Yeah,
that too.
please.
Say like there is an inherent uncertainty. I think that a bit of a hesitancy around making decisions and setting plans and making changes, that there is uncertainty that's inherent with natural resources. Things can, a fire coming through a watershed could drastically change things. So I think there's also an element of figuring out, in these decisions, what uncertainty can we live with and what uncertainty do we need to address. And I think there can be a tendency to really want to fully address all the uncertainty, which can be sometimes that's needed, and sometimes that can kind of delay decisions and changes being made.
Yeah,
So that's a
definitely.
balance.
Yeah, as a former research scientist, we love to control our conditions, but agricultural research and research in the environment really means we have to try to understand the ebbs and flows of nature. So yeah, definitely an interesting framing for science minds to really start to capture that. We have another question in the chat here. Is there any work being done on developing land races that require less water and generally are more accepted to their locality or locale?
Did you say land?
Land races is, I'm not sure if that's a
Maybe
typo.
land uses, like
Land
less
uses, yeah,
less water intensive land uses.
that must be it.
Oh, varieties of plants. That is not something that we have focused on very directly. Like I have heard and understand that there is interest in looking at, growing different types of crops, and that there's a whole field of expertise and research there around water efficient agriculture. It's not yet an area that we've delved into. I think it is an important one, but it's one I've struggled with a little bit because it's not clear to me it's not clear to me how possible and desirable it is from farmers' points of view to fundamentally change their farming practices. And so it's one of those questions that I think would be really worthwhile to explore. And it's a good example of one where there would need to be kind of a lead and a driver, a catalyst to scope out what the question is and what the decision is and what do we need to look at around that, with, I think, strong leadership from the local farming community, because I've been wary about that topic because it would be its own kind of initiative to figure that out.
So I see in the chat here that it was mentioned that a land race is a locally adapted strain, variety, or breed, so a specific plant type. But as you mentioned, unsure whether or not farmers wanting to change their practices, changing those different potential species that they're using as well.
Yeah, it's like where does I think whenever there's an idea, because there's so many ideas, like people in the advisory table say there's so many ideas, but ideas need some leadership behind them to actually build them out. So that's an idea that I haven't seen kind of being taken up and driven forward, but I imagine if it was, there'd be interest in the results.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it's using more drought resistant species and things like that. But yeah, that does mean changing a lot. We're changing. It means that does have broader implications, I guess, when it comes to kind of widespread use. So another question we have here is, how are major water users, for example, the Lake Cowichan water storage, and downstream there's the pulp and paper mill, are they being involved in the decision-making process with regards to the different scenarios that are being planned for water use within the watershed?
It's a good question. The Koksilah watershed neighbors the Cowichan watershed, and they are separate systems. So in the Cowichan, there is Cowichan Lake, there's Catalyst Paper downstream, and there's been a lot of work driven by Cowichan Tribes around protecting that system as well. But these are kind of separate processes, and so not related for this planning process.
Okay, cool. And I guess maybe that leads to a question. I'm wondering, is there much, has there been, is it outside the boundaries of this project to think about those boundaries with regards to the watersheds? Like, how does this watershed impact the ones around it? Is that kind of it's a core aspect of the decision making, or is it part of kind of, yeah, I guess I'm wondering what the thought process around that aspect might be.
Yeah, so when a water sustainability plan is triggered, that's through a ministerial order. And the ministerial order actually designates the area that is going to be subject to planning. And so there's, in the ministerial order, there is a map and there is a boundary around our planning area. And there's, I don't think there's any perfect way to draw lines on maps. We see many historically catastrophic examples of that, but in this case, you know, we have a pretty clear scope, and it's, I think, again, I think the hope is that making some of these changes, accomplishing a WSP in this area would then allow other watersheds to learn and hopefully build on the kind of successes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have to draw the line somewhere, though it's not always easy. Brilliant. So there's another question here. When you mentioned planning and convening supports that could be provided to communities, can you share some examples of what those supports would entail and how communities that need supports are being identified?
The first thing that comes to mind is thinking about the Cowichan Watershed Board. So they are a local led by Cowichan Tribes and the CBRD, the local government. They're a local watershed organization, and they have been a really important support to this process. They've acted as kind of this, I mean, on a whole number of different levels. They have just been the continuity. The members of that organization some of them live in this watershed, so they've been this constant voice and persistent voice for, you know, of encouraging that progress is made. But they've also done a lot of kind of behind the scenes, not very always glamorous tasks that have been absolutely essential to keep things kind of moving. Administrative, budget kind of supports, meeting organization. They've helped create partnerships by connecting people who need to work together. And they've been this kind of constant voice for the river and the health of the community and health of the river. So that's, I think they are, for me, one of the inspirations for the idea of regional watershed organizations. Like, I think that there are a few examples in BC of those kind of regional watershed organizations and Indigenous co-led watershed organizations. I think those could be a really powerful institution to add to the landscape in BC, or to enhance in the landscape in BC. On top of that, I think there's also, you know, there's skill sets that are really important. So some of the decision analysis, decision structuring skill sets, the facilitation, project management skill sets, the communication expertise. Yeah, it really, you need a team. You need to build a team to do these kind of complex collaborative processes, and you need. I think diversity is key. You need the silver bulleters, and you need the, you know, the really detail oriented folks. Like, you need that mix. Also having the ministries involved and having a range of experts and analysts from the government bodies has been really, really crucial. What I have noticed is that staff in all agencies that we've worked with and in Cowichan Tribes want this to happen as much as anyone in the community does. Um, Staff have been incredibly solutions oriented, creative in the things that they've come up with, committed to working together. And so building those relationships where it's not like community versus government, but we really are all trying to do this because there's a huge opportunity. Cultivating that kind of culture so that you can, yeah, have that really big kind of team approach, I think is crucial.
Yeah, as the old adage says, it takes a village, and so I definitely appreciate the need to bring in a lot of voices to I both identify those who need support and to provide that support as well. Okay, so we have about a couple of minutes left. Let's see, I'll just double check which one of these questions. Maybe we'll take two more questions. I'll um, maybe start with this one. This is a question kind of asking about if you've been able to garner support from the broader agricultural community to kind of go towards metering and reporting, in addition to adapting their farm practices to incorporate more modern technologies that support sustainable water withdrawals. So just kind of thinking, since you mentioned that this community is relatively rural, there are a lot of people involved in agriculture. Are we seeing the community themselves being very kind of keen to take up these practices? And are you seeing any of that reflected in the broader agricultural community as a whole?
We've started kind of the engagement in this process has really started with those advisory tables. And in 2025, the plan is to have targeted meetings and sessions with farmers to kind of reach that broader group who hasn't yet been very involved. And I think the question about metering and measuring reporting is a really interesting one, because I've definitely heard from farmers and more broadly in the community a very strong interest in decisions having a very transparent, clear rationale and being backed by science and information. So that is something people really care about and want to see. I think people are also aware that we can't manage what we can't measure, and there are a lot of gaps in knowledge around how much water is being used, and how that relates to what's been licensed. So building support from the agricultural community for those kinds of actions is going to be, I think, really important. And I actually feel quite optimistic that these are smart, useful, important things to do. I don't think that they have to be kind of considered threatening or like infringements. And I think that if we are thoughtful and early and honest in communicating what's being considered and how that can help everyone, everything I've seen from the agricultural community is that's what they want to. So I feel quite hopeful that we will build that broad support, and that effort's really going to ramp up here in 2025.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. Yeah, I think this is going to be a great example to be able to show more people that, what's possible. So I think we just have time for one more question. This is the most voted one, but so this person is really, I guess, asking about some good ways to push for more responsible water use by some of the bigger takers. So recognizing that there may be some larger farms, larger industry, larger operations that may be taking more than others. Is there a strategy to kind of, I guess, find equity within the work that's being done with regards to water use within the watershed?
Yeah, that's a good and challenging question. I mean, the intent of this process is to be minimizing the impacts on water users and to be bringing more certainty to water users. Um, it it would be really helpful if there was a big, you know, a big single user that was kind of the obvious culprit, but it's not. It is a lot more complex than that. Um, and as I mentioned, farms in the Koksilah region have already done a lot to contribute to water conservation and to good practices, so the irrigation scheduling that farmers are voluntarily doing to try to lessen impacts on streams, as like the key example. Um, it's really gonna, I think the equity comes in trying to make sure that there's a contribution from everyone, and that there's that contribution through land use changes, and restoration. Um, the challenge is that some of those, and you saw right in the in the graph, like the green is smaller and it doesn't kind of kick in till a little bit later. So, but ultimately, that kind of everyone contributing is going to, I think, be really crucial for success, as we try to untangle, yeah, what really is a situation where we're a little in over our heads on how water it's been allocated.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think, yeah, it's a great point to end off on. Is just really, we all have a part to play in the solutions to kind of get to where we want to be and make sure that we have a resilient system for us all and for our future generations as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Natasha. It's been so wonderful to hear about the successes and the challenges and the next steps for the projects that you've been working on. So let me just pull up my slides again. So we are at the end of our first session for this morning. We're going to be taking about a 15-minute break, and then we'll be back for our next session, which will be a project showcase. So we're going to just bump everyone back into the waiting room as we bring in our next round of speakers, and we'll open up the room again about just before 1/4 past the hour. So we will see you all then. I actually don't know how to do that. So I'm going to I'm going to end the webinar, and if please just use the same link to join us again in about 10 to 15 minutes.